Welcome, everybody. This is a webinar put on by Green Energy Consumers Alliance. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, we are a nonprofit organization based in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and our mission is all about empowering consumers and communities to a just transition to a zero carbon world. And what that means is we have lots of different programs and services that people can tap into to make the switch to clean energy technologies. Today, we're going to talk about electric vehicles, but we also have programs on wind and solar and heat pumps and lots of other things. And we also do public policy advocacy work at the state level in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island to make sure that we've got programs on the books and policies on the books that will help us meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals. My name is Anna Vanderspek. I'm our electric vehicle program director, and I'll be doing some of today's presentation, but I'm joined by two other colleagues as well that I'll let introduce themselves.
Hi, my name's Caroline. I'll be taking some of the presentation as well.
Hey everybody, I'm Caitlin. I'm the Drive Green intern, and I will be in the Q&A section, answering your questions to the best of my ability.
So today we're going to cover a bunch of things. We're going to cover how charging works in general. We're going to cover the different levels of charging. So what is level 1 versus level 2? How do you install a charging unit at home? How do you find charging on the go? And we're going to spend some time specifically on DC fast charging as well, the super fast charging that you use on road trips. As Caitlin mentioned, we absolutely welcome your questions. So throughout the webinar, if you have any, please go ahead to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and in the Q&A box, you can write in your questions and we'll answer them at the end. And similarly, if you would like closed captioning, you should see a CC box. And if you click on that, you'll see text appear at the bottom of your screen in real time as we speak. So with that, I will go ahead and move forward. So the first section we're going to talk about or go through today is how charging works. And this first slide is maybe a little intimidating, but it's important to just get a couple of key words down before we go through the rest of the presentation. I'm not an electrical engineer. This is not going to be a physics lesson, but there are some key terms that come into play a lot. So we're going to go through some key terms and what they mean. And I think that the most useful way to go through these terms is to think of electricity like water going through a pipe to fill up a bathtub. And so we'll use that metaphor throughout. So the first term that we see here is voltage. And voltage is determined by the power source and is measured in volts. So this is basically, if you think back to high school physics class, this is the potential energy. And in the metaphor about a pipe, it's the pipe size. Most household outlets are 120 volts. You'll see higher level voltage outlets for higher energy appliances or high power appliances like all electric dryers or heaters. And washing machines tend to use a 240 volt outlet, and so do level 2 charging stations, which we'll talk about later. But the key thing to remember for now is voltage determined by the power source, measured in volts, and it's the potential energy. Current is the next term here, and that is drawn by the electrical device, limited to a safe level by circuit breakers. That's what circuit breakers are for, and it's measured in amps. And that you can think of as the current or the speed, basically, of the electricity or the water running through the pipe. The voltage and current together determine the power. And if you're going to remember one of these basics of electricity from the presentation today, power is the one to remember when it comes to charging. It is basically the amount of energy delivered in a given amount of time, and it's measured in kilowatts. So if you think of a water pipe, you've got a combination of the speed of the water flow and the size of the pipe will determine the power or the flow of that water. And if you want to simplify it back to a pipe and a bathtub, it's the combination of that speed or current and the size that will determine how quickly you can fill up a bathtub. And to use the same metaphor with electric vehicles, it's the power of the charging that will determine how quickly you can fill up an EV battery. So power is when we come to talking about charging, we're going to talk a lot about kilowatts and power. The bigger the kilowatt number, the faster that vehicle can charge. But there's also the question of how big is the battery or how big is the bathtub? And that is when we're talking about that, we're talking about energy. Energy is the total capacity to do work, in this case, move a vehicle, and that is measured in kilowatt hours. So when we're talking about EVs, you hear a lot of kW or kWh. Kilowatt hours is the capacity to do work. It's how much energy you can stuff into that battery. Basically, it's the size of the bathtub. And then power is how quickly you can fill that battery or fill that bathtub. So when we talk about charging, you're going to see kilowatts a lot, either as a measure of power of an EV charging unit or a measure of how quickly any particular vehicle model can take in electricity. And we'll talk about all of that in more detail. But basically, the through line or the takeaways from this slide are power, it's chargers, kilowatts, kilowatt hours is batteries, and energy. So I'm going to start with this little graphic on the right to explain this a little bit more, and then we'll answer some key questions about what determines how fast you can charge and how far you could go. So a lot of times when people say electric vehicle charger, what they're referring to is the thing that you plug your car into. The technical term for this is EVSE, which stands for Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment. But basically what it is equipment that takes energy from the grid, from a plug in your home or somewhere out in public, and transfers it into the vehicle. And basically, EVSE is safety equipment. There's basically a little circuit breaker inside that charging station. It's just making sure that the vehicle is communicating with the grid and drawing electricity at the appropriate power level. What is actually technically considered a charger is built into the vehicle. And so in this little graphic, you see an onboard charger. What that exists to do is to take the electricity that's coming from an electrical power source. If we're talking about level 1 or level 2, it's coming in AC, alternating current, and it basically transforms it into DC, direct current, to put into the battery. So when you're talking just to an EV driver or sort of casually, you say charger, you're talking about EVSE, but there's actually an onboard charger that's doing that translation basically from AC to DC. So with that as context, a lot of questions we get from people are, how far can I go on my electric vehicle? And that depends on a couple different factors. The first is kind of naturally the size of the battery, or in this, to go back to the metaphor, the size of the bathtub. How many units of energy, how many kilowatt hours of electricity can you store in that vehicle? So on our EV Finder tool, we tell you what the kilowatt hour capacity is of various EV models, and you'll see that some of them are 65 kilowatt hours, some of them are 85 kilowatt hours. There's a range depending on the vehicle type and size and battery makeup. But the size of the battery is not the only thing that determines how far you can go. The efficiency of the vehicle is the other piece of the puzzle. So basically, how many miles can that vehicle go on every kilowatt hour of electricity that's stored in the battery? And there's a wide range in efficiency, particularly now as there are more and more really big electric vehicles on the road. The bigger and heavier the vehicle, the less efficient it's going to be. So it's a combination of the size of the battery and the efficiency that will determine how far you can go. And the third factor is weather. Last week, we just had a whole webinar about winter driving, where we talked about how cold temperatures impact the range or the functioning of your battery and therefore the range. So that's another factor that determines how far you can go. But the big ones are the size of the battery and the efficiency. This webinar, though, is all about charging. So the next question is, how fast can you charge? And there are a couple of factors. The first is the power source, specifically how much power, how many kilowatt hours is available from that power source. So you can have a vehicle that has a super high powered onboard charger and can receive electricity at 350 kilowatts, but if you're only plugged into something that can deliver 150, that's what you're going to charge at. And we'll go over that in more detail with some examples shortly. The second thing that impacts how quickly you can charge is the onboard charger. So how quickly can the onboard charger built into the vehicle receive power from an external power source? Weather also impacts charging, though less than it impacts range. Basically, when it's colder, and by colder, I mean when it's very, very cold, you can see that charging slows a little bit. But for more on that, we'll refer you to the winter driving webinar that we just did last week. So with this, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Caroline to give us a 101 on the different levels of charging.
Yeah, as we move in to talk about charging, we'll start with level one. Level one charging uses a regular household outlet. All EVs come with a cable that will plug into the outlet. Similar process as charging your smartphone. Um, the port for this particular type of charging that we are talking about is pictured below on the left. You can see that this vehicle has a cable that is plugged into a standard outlet. Most EVs have a J1772 port for level one and level two charging. This is except for Tesla, which uses the North American charging standard. All manufacturers are in the process of adopting the NACS port, but for now we can know that the NACS port can be used for all three levels of charging, which we'll get into. Um, for level one, household outlets, if you're charging at home, don't deliver a lot of power. And so the charging speed is 4 miles of range per charging. Um, Sometimes this varies between 2 or 6 miles per hour. This depends on several factors like how cold it is. 4 miles per hour is a good average. This may sound slow, but 4 miles of range per hour means that it would take 10 hours to, say, recharge overnight. If you drive 40 miles a day, this is actually the average driving distance for most Americans. So for most commutes to and from work, this is a this is plenty. This is a good mile of range. And while your car is charging, it's a fast process. Just take 10 seconds to plug in, and say you're charging at night, then you can go to sleep. And in the morning, your vehicle will be replenished with the miles that you need for the day. Um, so we'll move on to level two. Okay. So level two charging is faster than level one. Um, it makes driving an EV more convenient and more practical for those who drive longer distances. The level two charger uses the same ports as level one. This is, again, there's an exception for Tesla with the NACS port, but we're seeing all major manufacturers and their EVs coming forward with the NACS port, hopefully in 2025. And then the other outlet for level two is the J1772 port, all right, for everything else. Say, if you drove 250 miles a day, you can recharge the whole car overnight by plugging into a level two station. That is because um, the range is around 11 to 54 miles of range per hour when using level two. So we know that charging stations they're called electric vehicle supply equipment. This constitutes the cable and box, as you can see in the photo, that will connect your car to a 240 volt outlet. And this will manage the electric current running between the outlet and your vehicle. This prevents current from flowing if the charging port and cable aren't properly connected. So it's a safety mechanism. Level two is often installed at home, and level two charging stations can also be found at level two chargers can be found at public charging stations as well. Okay, now we have level three or DC fast charging. There was a standardization of the Tesla port. Now it is called the North American Charging Standard. This is used for all three levels of charging. So I'm saying there's been a standardization and an adoption. What that means is that for drivers of EVs from non-Tesla manufacturers, 20,000 Tesla supercharger ports are becoming available for these drivers. So it's really opening up the more accessibility to different chargers that are around. Yeah, and we'll talk about that in the next slide. So I mentioned that the North American Charging Standard port is becoming available. When I say all major manufacturers are adopting it, we're really talking about that. We've seen Ford, Rivian, General Motors. If you have a question about a manufacturer, they've probably adopted the NACS port. So the rollout has begun, and some manufacturers are making adapters for their existing vehicles. And there's been some delay with the supply chain, but we've still seen ports charging adapters become available for some drivers. And we expect that all new partner vehicles will have access to a NACS port on the vehicle or an adapter within 2025. If you're going to ask how fast a particular vehicle can charge in level 2, this graph really describes that. So on the left, we have the onboard charging capacity, and then in the middle, we will look at the medium level 2 charging speed because this ranges from vehicle to vehicle. And then on the right, we have different popular EV models. So if the onboard charging capacity is greater than 10 kilowatts, let's say the Chevy Blazer or the Hyundai Ioniq will reach 30 or more miles of range per hour. And then the maximum charging speed reduces a little bit as we see that some vehicles have a smaller onboard charger capacity. But in the last two rows, these are mostly plug-in hybrids. So we know that plug-in hybrids can also, well, can access level 1 and level 2 charging and have a small battery. And their range depends on the onboard charger capacity as well. And it can range from 11 to 22 miles of range per hour. Yeah. Okay. So if we're going to recap and think about charging speed and what does onboard capacity mean, we can think about the fact that if a car can charge quickly, it can't draw more than what the station can give out. So this means if you were to plug a car with an onboard charger capacity of 7.2 kilowatts into a 6.6 kilowatt station, it would charge at 6.6 kilowatts. Okay, yeah, we can have another example on the next slide. Okay, if we take the same car with the same onboard charger capacity of 7.2 kilowatts, and we plugged it into a station with 10 kilowatts per hour capacity, it would charge at 7.2 kilowatts. We know that automakers can improve this figure, but that adds different factors like the weight and complexity of the car. So it's important to remember that the car can't draw more power than what the station can give out. We've talked about charging at home. You can also charge on the go. We'll talk about that. Charging can be more convenient than gas. We know charging is different than gas, and part of making the switch to an EV is shifting your perspective because we are used to going to the gas station and refueling gas cars. But with an EV, you can take 10 seconds or like 2 minutes to plug in your EV and allow it to charge at night or while you're out. The median range for gas-powered vehicles is 412 miles, and EVs are almost there. We're seeing ranges coming close between 250 or 300 plus miles of range. If we look at an example, if you drive 40 miles a day, then you would have to refuel your gas car every 10 days. Probably you'll wait when you're close to empty. Sometimes you may take a detour to the gas station, and then this will add time to your commute while you're refueling your car. If you were to use a public charging station, you could charge your car somewhere you would stop anyway, like a grocery store or a gym. And this is exciting. Curbside charging is available in some cities, and Boston is in the process of getting their own side charging stations. Yeah. Okay. So you can also charge at home. Um, can charge at home with level 1 or level 2. And if you are deciding which is best for you, it really depends on how many miles you drive in a day. And we'll talk about installing a level 2 charging station the next few slides. So we have a couple of guidelines because the majority of EV drivers charge at home, right, either with a household outlet for level 1 or a level 2 charging station. If you would like to have some guidance, this guide really covers it all from determining your charging needs, how to pick a charging unit, and what exactly you would need an electrician for. Um, we will be passing out these guidelines when we email you with the recording, and we'll pass the slides and the guidelines so that you may take a look. So we have a guideline, like I just talked about, for single-family homes, but many folks live in apartment buildings or multi-unit dwellings. So we cover that as well in this guide. Okay, I'll briefly talk about fuel costs for EVs because we know that we've talked about how EVs are more efficient and sometimes cheaper than gas cars. So I'll briefly describe the process behind determining that it is cheaper to drive per mile on electricity than gas cars. So to begin, I made several assumptions. These are that on average, an EV uses 0.3 kilowatts of energy per mile. We'll assume that the average fuel efficiency of a gas car is 25.4 miles per gallon, and that the average price of gas is 3.23, so $3.23 per gallon. We can look at the different utilities on this graph. So we see that for National Grid territory, the cost per kilowatt hour is 34 cents. I'll just run through the process for this utility for the sake of time. But to calculate the cost per mile of electricity, we would multiply the total cost per kilowatt hour by the assumed efficiency of EVs per mile. So for National Grid, it's the same process for the other utilities. We would multiply the cost per kilowatt hour, 34 cents, by our assumed average of number of kilowatt hours that EVs use per mile. So 34 cents times 0.3 kilowatt hours. And then when we multiply those together, we find that the cost to drive per mile on electricity is 10 cents. We can then calculate really quickly the cost to drive per mile on gas. So we would divide the average gas price, $3.23, based on our assumption, by the assumed fuel efficiency of gas cars, and this is 25.4 miles per gallon. So we'll find that gas cars drivers pay per mile around 12 cents. And then quickly to reach our savings, we can subtract the cost per mile on gas by the cost per mile on electricity. And this is around 2 or 3 cents, depending on your utility. If you are interested in the reasoning and math behind this scenario, we will link to our reasoning behind our math in our slides when you receive them. I'll pass it off to Anna.
Thank you, Caroline. So Part of the reason why we link to our math is obviously A, we like to share our math, but we also at this point have a situation where what you pay for electricity might be different from what you saw on the previous slide, even if you're served by National Grid, Eversource, or Rhode Island Energy. And the reason for that is twofold. So, well, actually threefold. Some of you who are on this call might be served by a municipal light plant instead of one of our investor-owned utilities. Some of you might have your electricity delivered by one of the investor-owned utilities, but may have signed up with a competitive electricity supplier. And some of you, and an increasing number of you, may live in communities that are served by aggregation programs where your municipality goes out and procures electricity supply on your behalf. So we wanted to take a moment to just explain how to do this math for yourself if you'd like, looking at your electric bill. So we're just going to go through what all these line items are briefly to figure out how to do the math for yourself. So a couple things to notice on this sample bill. First, there's a fixed customer charge. So this is just a charge that you pay every month that is independent of how many kilowatt hours of electricity you consume. For this case, it's $10. It might be different for you depending on what electric utility you have, but because that is a fixed charge that's independent of how much electricity you use, we're kind of going to ignore it for this analysis. The second thing to notice is that the supplier on this bill is not Eversource, even though it's an Eversource electric bill. It's an aggregation program. So full disclosure, this is my electric bill from a couple of years ago. And I'm enrolled in the Cambridge Community Electricity Program. So I'm not on the basic service rate that we use to calculate all the math that Caroline just went over. I have a different rate. So that rate is here. So my generation service charge through that program is 13.669 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is different from what I would be paying if I were on the basic service rate with Eversource or had independently signed up with a competitive electricity supplier, which we do not recommend. But that only makes up half of what I pay per kilowatt hour because then there's also all these other charges. We're not going to go through them all one by one, but they all together are your delivery charges. And for me at that time, it added up to 14.622 cents per kilowatt hour. So if I want to figure out what I'm paying per kilowatt hour, I would add those generation charges to the delivery charges. And when I do that, that comes out to 28.91 cents per kilowatt hour. So you can see that that's lower than the 32 or 31 or 34 cents we just talked about. So an EV charged in this household would see even greater savings per mile compared to the math we just did because the electricity costs are lower. So if you haven't recently actually looked at your electricity bill, definitely worth doing that so you can understand exactly what you're paying. And if you want to do the math, you can use that figure. A different way of looking at this is just going with an example with a particular car and saying, okay, what are you going to pay for 100 miles of driving? So for this example, we took the Chevy Equinox EV, which is one of the most affordable electric vehicles out there right now. Its starting MSRP is well under the average price of a new vehicle of any type in the country, and it also qualifies for the federal tax credit and the state rebates in both Massachusetts and Rhode Island. So it's a very popular vehicle. It has a battery that is 85 kilowatt hours of capacity, and it gets 319 miles per charge. So if we're assuming we're driving this vehicle and we're driving 100 miles, how much is it going to cost? In National Grid territory, it'll cost you about $9. In Eversource territory, it'll cost you about $8.50. And in Rhode Island Energy's territory, it'll cost you $8.26. If I were to charge that vehicle on the rates that I just had on the previous slide, it would be even lower than that, but you can get a sense of, okay, 100 miles, somewhere between $8 and $9. If we take a relatively efficient gas car, so one that gets 30 miles per gallon, and use current gas prices, which for New England right now average to be $3.14, according to the Energy Information Administration, driving a gas-powered car 100 miles at 30 miles per gallon would cost about $10.60. So you can see that those savings per mile add up when you start thinking about 100 miles at a time. With that, I will turn it back over to Caroline to talk about how to find public charging and how to navigate all those systems.
Yeah, there's a lot of public level 2 charging stations available, especially in New England and in Massachusetts. Um, Having a charger at home isn't always the most convenient for some drivers, especially for renters. So it's really great to know the different tools that will help you locate a level 2 charger. PlugShare is one of those tools, and it is an app and website. This screenshot on the slide showcases the number of level 2 chargers in operation across Massachusetts. Um, so PlugShare is open sourced, which means it will also filter and show you non-network chargers because a lot of chargers are networked. We'll cover costs in the next slide because they vary, but it's good to know that on PlugShare, you can filter what you're looking for with factors that include whether the charging station is near an amenity like a bathroom or like a shopping center. You can filter what level of charging is available at the station. Maybe and I think also filter on cost. So it's a good way to find chargers because often on if you say you use like Google or Apple Maps, EV chargers are often filtered out. Okay. So I mentioned that a lot of public chargers are networked. Um, this means that these companies, these networking apps that we see on the screen, are in charge of those charging stations. ChargePoint is a big one, and we see a majority ChargePoint chargers in New England. Um, and a lot of charging stations are really smartphone heavy and considered like smart stations because they will be connected to an app sometimes, which will enable you to monitor your charging in real time. It'll give you a real-time estimation of costs. You're also able to get notification when charging. There are also non-network stations that mean not connected to your smartphone, may not require you to have an app. Um, and because they're not part of a system, sometimes they can be harder to locate. I mentioned that PlugShare is open source, so people can in real time can report where a non-network charging station is located. And to briefly speak about costs, it's hard to give an estimation because some stations charge by the kilowatt hours that go into your car and others charge by the time you spend parked next to the charger, um, like a normal parking space. So sometimes charging is free. It varies. And one last thing I'll mention is that with ChargePoint, you can actually have a membership. A lot of times this is really convenient um, to find for finding charging. There are also some other great sources, like a Better Route Planner, which we can talk about if you have any questions about that. I'll pass it back on to Anna. Thank you.
So, as Caroline mentioned, there are lots of different charging network companies. So it can be a little intimidating if you're new to the space, how to figure out which apps you need to download, which networks to be part of. And so we wanted to sort of illustrate how you might go about doing this. So say you are planning a trip to Providence to go see the Roger Williams Park Zoo, and you want to figure out, okay, can I charge along the way? What does that look like? So what we would recommend is that step one is you go to PlugShare. And on PlugShare, you can type in the address and see what charging stations are nearby. So that is the middle screenshot on the screen. It'll show you, okay, at Roger Williams Park Zoo, there's a J1772 ChargePoint charging station. It tells you the exact address. It tells you that there's a park and restrooms and dining nearby. It tells you that the parking lot is available 24/7. It tells you exactly where they are, that they're just to the left of the main entrance. And if you were to scroll down on the actual app or website, you could see photos or people who have recently checked in or used the charging station to tell you if it's working or how fast it charged and things like that. So that can give you some of the basic information. It'll also tell you what the costs are. But then if you want to get a little bit more detail, like exactly what power level are these charging stations at? How do I pay? You can see, okay, on PlugShare, it'll tell you this is a ChargePoint station. So then you can open up the ChargePoint app and get a little bit more information. The apps from the actual charging network operators may tell you if somebody's currently charging or how many of the stations are currently available. And on some, not many, but some charging station locations, the apps may allow you to reserve a spot in the future. That's something that's kind of new in this space. We'll see if it really kicks in and takes off. But most drivers, I think, will then end up using the ChargePoint app or the Electrify America app or whatever it is to look up more information about that station. The other thing to note is that a lot of the paying for the charging stations goes through these apps, and a lot of them are interoperable. So you may pull up to a charging station that is branded with one of these charging networks, but you may very well be able to pay for it and find it on the app of the charging network that you use more frequently because all the manufacturers or these networks understand that if the stations are interoperable, if you can use one, even if you're a member of a different network, that benefits the industry as a whole. So what I think most new drivers do is start with PlugShare, depending on where you're going, see what charging stations are there. You'll get a feel for which apps you want to download and then which ones you use the most frequently. And then if you go somewhere new, you can see, okay, based on the apps I currently use, am I good? Do I need to download anything new? But a lot of work is being done on the back end to make all of these more interoperable. Okay, so that was sort of our general discussion about public charging and at-home charging. Now we're going to talk specifically about fast charging because we get a lot of questions about fast charging. So this has its own section today. So earlier, on one of the very first slides, we had a graphic that shows how AC charging or level 1 or level 2 charging works. And that's where on this graphic, it's blue. You get electricity from a level 1 or level 2 outlet in alternating current. It goes to the onboard charger, which translates it into DC current, which puts it directly into the battery, the lithium ion battery. And that's managed by the BMS or the battery management software. With DC fast charging, what's happening instead is the vehicle is receiving electricity in direct current, and that allows you to bypass that whole onboard charger situation and allows you to charge the battery up directly and much faster. So in this graphic, it's a 50 kilowatt DC fast charger. We'll see that there's a wide range in how quickly DC chargers can charge your vehicle. But that, first of all, is the distinction. That's why level 3 charging is known as DC fast charging. It's because it's direct current. Caroline already alluded to this a little bit earlier or explained it a little bit earlier, but right now we're in a unique time in the world of DC fast charging, and that up until this point, the market has been split into a couple different standards. So historically, European and American manufacturers have used the J1772 combo for DC fast charging. Asian manufacturers have used the CHAdeMO plug, which you can see is just physically very different from this J1772. And Tesla has used its own proprietary charging system. Now the market is all moving towards this North American Charging Standard, or NACS, which again is the plug on the bottom right. It's based on the Tesla charging network, but now it's open to other manufacturers. It's one plug that can do level 1, level 2, and level 3 charging, or one port, I should say, that can do all three. And it is being rolled out this year and next year. So some manufacturers have already made those adapters available. Others are going to be making the adapters available soon. And supposedly with model year 2025, we will start seeing those NACS chargers built right into non-Tesla vehicles as well. So we're in a weird spot right now where we've got a couple different things going on, but moving forward, it's all going to be standardized to one plug type. With DC fast charging, first question we get is, okay, how fast can I actually charge? And I wish that there were a very easy answer, but unfortunately, it really depends, and it depends on a couple different factors. So, as we've talked about before, one of the primary factors is what is the station power? Like, is that DC fast charger delivering direct current at 50 kilowatts, 100 kilowatts, 350 kilowatts? That is a big factor in how fast you can charge. And similarly, how quickly the vehicle can receive that electricity is also a factor. We talked about that earlier. With DC fast charging, there's some other things that matter too, and one of them is the state of charge. So a vehicle that is only 10% full, so to speak, will charge faster than a vehicle that is 90% full. And we'll go over that in a moment about how the speed of DC fast charging changes with the state of charge. The total battery capacity also matters. So it'll take you longer to fill up a bigger battery than it would take you to fill up a smaller battery. The temperature matters. As we mentioned before, if it's very, very cold, it takes a little bit longer to charge because first the vehicle has to warm the battery up to the right temperature, and that takes some energy. And then the vehicle efficiency is more a matter of how far you can go, but can also speak to how quickly you can receive that electricity. On the right, we have a very generalized, and I really need to stress that it is a generalized table about how fast you can charge at different levels. So fast charging is really DC fast charging, and you can have a DC fast charger that delivers 25 kilowatts. There's some that are even lower than that, all the way up to 350 kilowatts. And there's even some talk about making even higher power chargers, particularly for medium and heavy duty vehicles. But for passenger vehicles, it's largely somewhere between 50 and 350. And here are some very loose estimates where you can see, okay, at 50 kilowatts, you can expect maybe 90 miles in half an hour. At 100, you might expect 166 miles in half an hour. And at 150, you can do 200 miles in half an hour. But the state of charge of your battery and the particular vehicle that you drive will really impact those figures. So here's an example of what I mean. So here are just a couple of vehicles. This is illustrative, that where we've pulled out, okay, what is the maximum power that that vehicle can receive per the manufacturer's information? And then what does the manufacturer publish on their website in terms of how fast you can charge? And you can see that the manufacturers don't even have a consistent way of displaying this information. So we have here a couple of all-electric vehicles, the Nissan Leaf, the Nissan Leaf Plus, the Kia Niro electric vehicle, and the Hyundai Ioniq 5. And the range for those vehicles is anywhere between 150 and 303 miles per charge. The Leaf has a max power of 50 kilowatts. The Hyundai Ioniq 5 has a max of 350 kilowatts. And the manufacturers have some information on their website of how long does it take to get from zero, so a completely empty battery, to a battery that is 80% full, assuming you are charging at the maximum power available to that vehicle. So for a Nissan Leaf, you might need 40 minutes to get 120 miles, but for a Hyundai Ioniq 5, you might only need 18 minutes to get 242 miles. So that shows you a little bit the range of vehicles. On our EV Finder, we share for every vehicle that's available what that max power draw is. So if it's very important to you to be able to charge very fast, you can sort and filter and look at just vehicles that have that really high kilowatt capacity for their DC fast charging, but there is a wide range in different vehicle models. So it's important, if this is important to you, to make sure you look at that particular spec when you're comparing different vehicle models. I mentioned that the state of charge will impact how quickly you can charge your vehicle. And to sort of illustrate that, we have a sample charging session of a Chevy Bolt, which is a very popular electric vehicle that's not currently being made, but will be made again soon. And so we have a sample charging session here where the vehicle is plugged in at a DC fast charger when it is 5% full. So the state of charge, or the total sort of charge level of that battery, is very low. It's at 5%. In the first 30 minutes, when the battery is the most empty, you will charge the fastest. If we go back to that the bathtub metaphor, you can think of when the bathtub is very empty, you can have that faucet at full throttle and not worry about overflowing. But as you get closer and closer to the bathtub being full, you might slow down how fast you're adding water just to make sure that you don't overflow. That's kind of a metaphor for what's happening here, except this is very complicated battery chemistry that is beyond me. But in that first 30 minutes of charging, you might add 98 miles on this Chevy Bolt. And then you're at 43% full. And at that point, the battery management software will go, okay, we're closer to full, let's slow down a little bit. And so the next 30 minutes, you might only add 90 miles because the vehicle's battery management software system is going to say, okay, we got to throttle, we got to slow down just a little bit, just to be careful. And then when you get to 80% capacity, that's really the point where charging really slows down. So even though this Chevy Bolt can draw energy at 50 kilowatts, at around 80% capacity, it's going to say, nope, we're not doing 50 kilowatts. We're going to slow down to 25. And the main reason for that is that to protect the long-term health of the battery, you want to reduce heat. And if you're charging still at 50 kilowatts when the battery is that close to full, the battery is going to get hot, and that's just not a thing that we want to have happen. So the battery management system is very sophisticated and will sort of throttle charging when you get closer to full. So where you might see 98 and 90 miles in the first 2 sets of half hours, in that last hour, you might only add 51 miles of charge because you've slowed down. What does this mean for you as a driver? If you're going on a road trip, it might make sense to stop more frequently for smaller periods of time than to run your battery all the way down to 0 and then sit at a DC fast charging station until you're all the way up to 100% again. The good news is that many of these vehicles will calculate for you the best charging plan right in the vehicle. So a lot of the Teslas, for example, if you put in a destination in the vehicle, it will say, okay, stop at this supercharger for exactly 18 minutes, stop at this one for 9 minutes, and they will map out the most efficient route for you. For vehicles that don't have that capability, there's a really excellent app and website that Caroline mentioned earlier called A Better Route Planner, which basically does the same math for you depending on which vehicle you drive. So big takeaway here is charging will slow dramatically after 80%, and the state of charge really matters for the speed. At this point, we get a lot of questions about, okay, so DC fast charging, where is it? How is it being built out? So this is a graphic or a screenshot again from PlugShare. I'll stress that PlugShare is one of those websites where the more you zoom in, the more charging stations sort of pop up. So there are a couple places on this map that look a little sparse, but there's more and more charging being built all the time. You may have heard of the NEVI program. This is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program that came out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in 2022. This does two things. Well, the main thing it does is it hands funding to every state in the nation that wants to accept it to build out DC fast charging stations every 50 miles on major travel corridors, so that if you want to drive from here to California, every 50 miles on major highways, there will be at least 4 150 kilowatt DC fast chargers available to you. The amount of funding per state is calculated by some complicated formula. Massachusetts received $63.5 million. Rhode Island received $23 million. And all the states are in various levels of actually building out this charging. So Rhode Island is already done. They completed their phase one. There's not a lot of major interstate highways in Rhode Island, so they did a couple installs and they're done. Massachusetts is working on building out those stations now, and the first ones are expected to come online in the spring. In Massachusetts, there's also funding available for DC fast charging stations through programs by the utilities. If you've been to one of our webinars about incentives, you might have heard about these make-ready incentives. There's $400 million total for charging in that pot. A subset of that has been for DC fast charging. The public DC fast charging funding is already used up, but there's still funding for DC fast charging for fleets or other entities. I know we're already coming up on 1 o'clock, so I'll just very briefly mention that when you charge matters. We just had a webinar last week about a new electric vehicle demand response program in Rhode Island. But the long and short of this is that if you've heard of peak hours or peak days, there are moments in our electricity usage when electricity usage is really, really high. And those moments throughout the year are the most expensive and the most polluting. So it's very important to not exacerbate those peaks by charging our EVs. But instead spread that demand out so that we don't have these really high peaks as much. And there are different types of programs that utilities can and do offer to incentivize EV drivers to not charge on peak. So right now, if you are a National Grid customer, there's an off-peak charging rebate available to you. And if you're a Rhode Island Energy customer, you can enroll in the demand response program. We can send more information out about that if you're interested. We just didn't have time to go through it all in detail today. But very quick note, it matters when you charge. We'll turn to questions. I know we only have a couple minutes, so let's see what we got. I know there's a lot in the chat here. Okay. I am just going to go in the order that the questions came in because there's too many for me to scan. So first question is, what is the proper etiquette when you charge at different public level 3 chargers when the EV has an onboard charger that maxes out at 50 kilowatts? I think what this question is saying is, should you change how you charge if you're charging with a vehicle that has a lower, for example, if you've got a vehicle that can only charge at 50 kilowatts, but the charging station is 350 kilowatts, I don't think that this is a question of etiquette yet. I think the main, when you think about public charging and etiquette, the most important thing is move your vehicle when you're done charging. I don't think anybody is going to worry about if you're charging at a 350 kilowatt charger, but you can only take 50 kilowatts. That's too much for people to pay attention to. But if you're done, definitely move your vehicle so that somebody else can use that charger. Then we have a question that says, okay, I'm summarizing a bit. I pay less than what you had on your math per gallon for gas, and my vehicle is very efficient. Does that mean I shouldn't get an electric vehicle? This is obviously a personal question. What I want to stress, though, is that this webinar was all about charging, so we only talked about the benefits, or the cost benefits of electric vehicles when it comes to fuel costs, but there are really significant benefits to electric vehicles on maintenance and operation costs as well. So when we talk about that in our webinars, we usually cite a consumer report study that says over the life of a vehicle, you can expect about half the maintenance and repair costs in an electric car compared to an equivalent gas-powered car. And for most people, that ends up being somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000 over the life of the vehicle. So that's something to factor in with your personal situation as well. The other thing to stress is that gas prices historically are volatile. So right now, you might be getting a good price per gallon, but 6 months from now, all bets are off. Electricity prices historically have been more stable, with the big exception of that jump that we saw after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Natural gas prices really jumped, and that impacted our electricity prices. But beyond that aberration, basically, electricity prices have been much more stable. And when electricity prices change, there's a whole process where the Department of Public Utilities or the Public Utilities Commission has to approve any of those changes, which is not true. There's no public entity approving changes in gas prices. So right now, the math might pencil out one way, but it's important to think about that volatility in the long term as well. Let's see. There's a lot of questions, so I'm trying to figure out which ones. Okay. There's one question about do we know of a source comparing and reviewing chargers to assist in the decision? And I would point you to the same sorts of entities that review lots of other technology. So Consumer Reports, Wirecutter, they all have reviews of different charging stations. The main thing when you're looking at charging stations is if you are in Massachusetts or Rhode Island, you should check whether there is an incentive program with your particular utility or your state. That is true depending on where exactly you live. There's different resources. We've got a link that explains that, but often those programs have a list of approved chargers. So step one is do that. Step two is always make sure that the charging station you are purchasing is UL listed. That is the underwriter's laboratory. Some people are selling level 2 chargers mostly online that are not UL tested, and that just means they haven't gone through the rigorous safety testing that you really want your technology to have gone through. So always make sure you're getting a UL listed charger. Okay. I will answer one more question, and then I'm so sorry, there's a lot of questions that we're just not going to get to, but please, we will respond to you individually when we go through the questions later. But if you had a question that we didn't get to, feel free to email us. The last question is about time of use rates. It seems like it's a patchwork. What's going on there? The long and short answer, or the short answer to that is yes, it is a patchwork. The different utilities have different programs. There is no coherent state strategy. And this is something we've talked a lot about on the advocacy side of things, and happy to connect to talk more about that. But in recognition of the fact that it's 1 o'clock, I will just share this slide, which I'm kind of contractually obliged to do, which is we're a nonprofit. We very much want to keep putting on webinars like this for free to people across Massachusetts and Rhode Island. If you are so inclined and able, we would be very grateful for a donation. Our link for that is greenenergyconsumers.org/donate. And if you'd like to engage with us in other ways, we've got lots of different ways for you to do this, either on social media. We've got a Drive Green community Facebook group where you can talk to real life EV drivers and ask them about their charging. We've got a newsletter, we've got a pledge, we've got lots of things. But because it's already 1 o'clock, I will say we will send you all those links in a follow-up email. Thank you very much for joining us today, and have a good rest of your Wednesday.